Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started with the talk today. So today we have Sarah Mikula. She's going to be giving our talk. She's from CEMAS. She's the laboratory manager here. She keeps a lot of the place running and then also has a lot of expertise in biological sample prep. So I really appreciate having someone at CEMAS being able to do that, talking to her and understanding that a little bit more. I think it's a lot of the background here at CEMAS is going to be more on the materials side. So it's a great addition that we have here at CEMAS. A lot of her background, as I said, was in biological sample preparation. Previously, before CEMAS, she was at OSU in the Center for Microscopy and Imaging facility, which is more biological prep and screening facility here at CEMAS. I think Tom gave a talk a couple weeks ago on optical microscopy. And prior to that, she did a lot of research at Max Planck, and before that did a lot of other biological sample prep and lab manager experience. So it's great to have her here today talking about biological sample prep. And I'll mention the upcoming talks as well. So next month, we'll hopefully be back in person and virtual with Professor Peter Rez from Arizona State University talking about ultra high resolution energy electron loss spectroscopy. And going on from there, with the new year, we have talks in electron microscopy under cryogenic conditions with Dan. I was talking to him and he wants to kind of run the whole gambit of doing FIB, which he works on quite a bit, all the way to different kinds of TEM as well. So not specifically what most people think of as cryo TEM now. And then Giovanna will be giving a talk kind of related in the cryo EM field related to biological research on the glacios. For today's talk, Sarah is here live, which is great. She wasn't sure if she'd be able to make it quite on time since she had some other commitments, but we have it recorded. We'll play that video. Feel free to ask questions during it. Sarah can probably message during it a little bit as well, or answer questions afterwards as well. But again, as with the rest of the Beyond the Scope talks, these have been a little bit shorter in length. We're in for about 20 minutes on this talk. So think of lots of questions and we'll have plenty of time afterwards to have a discussion about the talk and also anything else you're interested in. So please, feel free to put things in chat for my things, questions for afterwards in the Q&A. And then afterwards, we can also click raise your hand and we can talk as well. So let me go ahead and start video up and we'll.
Hi, thanks for joining us for the Beyond the Scope series. I'm going to do today's webinar. My name is Sarah Mikula, and I am the Safety Officer and Lab Manager at CEMAS, the Center for Electron Microscopy and Analysis at The Ohio State University, located in Columbus, Ohio. I'm also one of the sample preparation specialists we have here, and I have my specialty is in preparing biological samples for room temperature processing, resin embedding, and sectioning. I've been here for about 3 years at OSU, and I'm originally from Oregon, but I had the distinct pleasure of working for about 10 years in Germany at the Max Planck Institute of Neurobiology in the Department of Winfried Bank, Electrons, Photons, and Neurons. And in that decade, I got really good at sample preparation for electron microscopy. And I wanted to talk today about, I'm going to share my screen. I wanted to talk about resin embedding. I know this might not be the most exciting topic, but I think that the fundamentals of electron microscopy are really important. And many people who prepare biological samples for electron microscopy are going to need to embed their samples in resin. So hopefully this is back to the fundamentals and useful for many people. So why do we care about embedding samples? Many biological samples do not have the structural stability required for sectioning or milling. So we need to add structural stability to that sample. We do this by, well, okay, we'll get to that in a second, but if we infiltrate a sample with a material, like a resin, we can also infiltrate it with other things that can enhance the conductivity of the sample. We can include things in the resin like carbon black or silver that can help dissipate charging artifacts in the sample. And we can also make that sample not only more structurally stable, but also it can resist beam damage better. So even if you have a sample like a tooth, you might still consider embedding it rather than just polishing it, because the resin, once it infiltrates your sample, can help it stand up to beam damage better, help keep it more stable while you're imaging it. A word about embedding only for beam damage resistance, though. If you're looking at a structure and you want to measure the diameter of a hair, for example, don't resin embed it. It's not going to help you. Just image it in the SEM, because if you coat it in a resin, obviously it's going to change the diameter that you can measure. So keep in mind, it's not useful for everything. Its usefulness is only as useful as your experimental goals and how well your method aligns with them. So when you are considering choosing a resin for your project, you'll want to consider a few different characteristics. Different resins will have different viscosities. Some of them infiltrate into samples much better than others. Unfortunately, the ones that infiltrate very well don't necessarily resist beam damage better. So if you're working with a dense sample, you might consider opting for a lower viscosity resin to make sure that it infiltrates your sample better. Otherwise, you can go with a higher viscosity resin and emphasize a different characteristic that you might be more interested in. Curing temperatures. So you want to make sure that the resin you're working with cures at a temperature that does not exceed causing damage to your sample. Many resins cure around 60 degrees Celsius, which for a living biological sample would be uncomfortably hot. But once it's chemically fixed and heavy metal stained, 60 degrees does not seem to cause damage to electron microscopy samples, biological samples. For resins, you also want to make sure that it's stable. I'll talk in a minute about different formulations of EPON. You can mix up EPON hard or EPON soft or anywhere in between. There's a spectrum of hardnesses. You want to make sure that the block you end up with is stable enough, hard enough, that you can cut it and it's not going to bend under the force of a diamond knife or a razor blade. And even if you're milling, you're still going to want a hard block. You want to make sure that whatever your embedding medium is, it's compatible with a diamond knife or milling. There is some recent information based on ion sources and milling showing that different resins have different compatibilities. So you want to be careful and select a resin that is compatible with either your ion source if you're milling or a diamond knife. Most resins are compatible with a diamond knife, but not all of them. Some of them can chemically attack diamond or glass. Beam damage resistance is always good, something to keep in mind. If your sample is not dense and it can withstand any temperature and it's already plenty stable, you just want to take sections from it and you need to embed it in resin, I recommend then opting for a resin that has a lot of beam damage resistance. Some resins also have different requirements for dehydration. Some resins are water miscible and some are not. And the ones that are not water miscible require dehydration of the sample before you can infiltrate. Otherwise, you'll trap water inside your sample. Resin won't get all the way in there and you'll have poor infiltration. Also, if your protocol requires further methods like immunostaining of sections, you can choose a resin that will optimize for immuno-EM. There are a few that are known for not masking antigen sites the way that some resins are. So, general protocol overview for embedding once you have your sample and it's been stained as you like or not as you like. Generally, you want to consider dehydration if necessary. I will also try and make this PowerPoint available. There are links in it, so I'm not just going to read you walls of text. Dehydration if necessary, infiltration, whether or not dehydration is necessary, infiltration of the resin into the sample is almost always necessary. Unless you're working with a solid piece and you don't care about the resin getting inside the sample, you only care about creating structural stability around that sample, then you don't even need to infiltrate. You just drop your sample in some liquid resin and cure it. And the last step is curing. That creates a monolithic hard block of resin. And then after samples are cured, you can continue with your sectioning, milling, or smoothing, whether you're looking at a section, a milled face, or a diamond knife smoothed block. These are some of the resins I'm going to talk about. These are pretty common resins used for embedding. So EPON is a standby. It's been used for a very long time. It's referenced in electron microscopy sample preparation texts, books, and publications both. It's very common. Aerodyne, which has a higher viscosity. We'll go into the details in a bit. Jerkapan, Spurs, glycol, methacrylate, white, and Lowercurls. So I will just go through these. So the original EPON 812 was made by the Shell Chemical Corporation as an epoxy. A generic version of that was created and they called it EPON 812. So I think these are quite confusing names, but they are technically two different things. EPON is great. It's a jack of all trades, in some ways master of none. It can be made to different hardnesses. It's very easy to look up protocols ranging EPON soft to EPON hard, and there are like 5 versions, as many as you want, I suppose. It's commonly used for TEM sectioning, and it also does require a dehydration step, but many tissues, once you've stained them with heavy metals, running them through an alcohol dehydration series isn't going to do much damage to them. Aerodyne is a more viscous resin. It resists being damaged better than the conventional epoxy. It has a higher viscosity, so it doesn't infiltrate samples quite as readily. It's also colorless. EPON is a bit yellow when it's cured. I mean, it could range from yellow to orange based on the amount of accelerant you use in your recipe. But Aerodyne is colorless, which is nice if you're doing kind of correlative light and electron microscopy or something to consider. Aerodyne might be a really good choice for doing something like cell monolayers in a CLEM project, because then you could do some fluorescent imaging in a very thin layer. And once your sample is even embedded in it. Jerkapan, I really like Jerkapan. It is a proprietary resin, so I am not 100% sure of what the monomer is. It comes in 2 versions. One is water miscible and one is not. It has very good beam damage resistance, and its viscosity is slightly lower than some of the common aerodynes. So what I tend to keep on hand for our lab and our purposes is glycol methacrylate, which I'll talk about in a minute. EPON, because it's a very good starting point, and Jerkapan for when I need something with high beam damage resistance. So I can highly recommend this one. Spurs is also, okay, we should also have Spurs. Spurs is, as far as I know, it's one of the lowest viscosity resins. It can infiltrate dense samples very well and also large samples very well. There's an interesting history about this resin because the monomer that was originally published, which is a low viscosity, is generally not included. When you buy a Spurs kit, it's often a Spurs substitute. And after having compared the two monomers, I can say definitively, the original monomer is substantially lower in viscosity than the substitute, which I find really interesting. So if you are looking for something new, low viscosity is very important to you. Look into getting the original chemical instead of the substitute, because the substitute will be higher viscosity. Unfortunately, Spurs does not resist beam damage very well, so it does infiltrate samples, but it will react to the beam. Also, Spurs in my hands has occasionally resulted in very brittle samples, so it could be worth looking into including a plasticizer, whether it's dibutyl phthalate or an anhydride, just to make the block a little bit harder. Something to play around with, but Spurs is excellent for a very low viscosity resin. Glycol methacrylate is my preferred water miscible resin. It's very good. It's finicky to work with. This is a resin that you need to pre-polymerize, which means you have to heat it up and wait until it increases its viscosity a little bit before you even put your sample in it. You don't need to dehydrate your sample through an ethanol dehydration series or use acetone or any kind of solvents like that. The glycol methacrylate functions as a dehydrating agent in some ways. So as you are doing the infiltration, you're replacing the water in the sample, but you're never really getting rid of all of the water. So it's really crucial that your sample retains some water or at least isn't exposed to alcohols. Glycol methacrylate is a really good option. Oh, yes, when you cure it, it needs to be protected from exposure to air or it doesn't cure completely. It'll have a layer of uncured polymer on the surface, which can make a mess. So it's recommended to use encapsulated molds like beam capsules or gelatin capsules, or even if you want to use a plate mold, you can just cover the thing with paraffin or ceramic, as long as it's airtight. It should be fine. Color white. The references on this are a bit long. I found a reference list that's linked in this talk. You can see. LR white is also water miscible, and this is an excellent resin for if you're doing any antibody staining. It doesn't mask antigens like other resins might, and it's very popular for that kind of thing. I think LR gold is also another option for antibody staining preferred resins. Lowercurls are interesting. I haven't worked with them very much. These are resins used for embedding samples at really low temperatures. So this is used in association with, for example, a high pressure frozen sample. So if you want to avoid chemical fixation, in fact, I think the last time I gave my Beyond the Scope talk, it was about high pressure freezing. So if you have a high pressure frozen sample, your options, you pretty much have two options. You can either take it through a freeze substitution step where you replace the vitreous ice with a chemical fixative as it comes back to room temperature, or a chemical fixative with a heavy metal stain in it so that it comes back to room temperature, and then you can embed it in a room temperature resin, one of the other resins. Or you can infiltrate it at a very low temperature in a Lowercurl, a resin that is made to work under very cold temperatures. So the original ones were K4M and HM20, polar and non-polar resins. And then there were a couple of improvements, K11M and HM23, and these resins work just like the others, polar and non-polar, but they work at even lower temperatures. So I don't have a lot of experience with this, but I find them quite interesting. And if I were going to get into high pressure freezing without the desire to bring samples back up to room temperature, I would use them. When I've done high pressure freezing in the past, I have done freeze substitution so that I could do further staining at room temperature. These are some excellent references that I found. An overview. The second has a very nice history in a table form of sort of the development of resins over the last 100 years. It's a really interesting read. Resins are very useful when preparing biological samples for electron microscopy. Some resins require dehydration, some do not. So be aware of your sample requirements. You can choose different resins for different characteristics, strengths, or weaknesses. If you're working with an electron microscopy core and they only use one resin, that's fine. It's probably EPON, it's a good one. But if your experiment requires certain parameters, don't be afraid to ask. Just give them a heads up that you prefer to emphasize a certain characteristic, and I'm sure they'll be happy to work with you. Microscopy facilities are great. We're all very friendly. And if you, speaking of being friendly, if you have any questions or would like to reach out to talk about this further, feel free to email me. I like talking about this stuff, so there is no such thing as an unwelcome question. This concludes my talk. I should be around to answer questions in real time. I am doing this virtually for some time constraints, but yes, feel free to ask any questions, and thank you very much for your time.